At its long-term average, at its impotia nostrum aris in pou, the Great Salt Lake covers about 1,700 square miles. On the 7th of November, 2022, it covered less than 1,000. The water had pulled back far enough that the gauge at Saltaire read 4,188.5 feet above sea level, the lowest number in a record that reaches back to the 1870s. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 square miles of former lake bottom was sitting in the open air, dry, cracked, and available to the wind. Now put that next to a second number. The 4 counties immediately downwind of that dry bed hold more than 2.5 million people. Salt Lake City, Ogden, Provo, Bountiful, Magna, Toole, and the ring of suburbs stitched between them all sit along the eastern and southeastern side of the basin, which is exactly where the prevailing spring winds push. Most of the world's shrinking salt lakes are drying up in front of a nearly empty landscape. This one is drying up in front of a metropolitan area. Then there's a third number, and it's the one that changes what the first two mean. When researchers pulled sediment from the lake's main southern basin around the time of that record low and ran it for toxic elements, arsenic came back at concentrations ranging from a fraction of a microgram per gram of dry sediment all the way up to about 119. The consensus level at which sediment arsenic starts producing harm in bottom-dwelling organisms sits a little under 10. The level at which harm becomes probable is 33. 60% of the southern basin samples cleared the first line. More than a quarter cleared the second. Lead, copper, zinc, thallium, and mercury turned up too, in smaller and more scattered amounts. But arsenic is the one that stays stubbornly high and refuses to decline the way the others have. So the basin holds a shrinking terminal lake, a wide skirt of exposed bed carrying more than a century and a half of mining, smelting, and refining residue on top of whatever the rivers brought down on their own, and a couple of million people living directly in the path of whatever the wind decides to lift. That's the environment. The question this whole thing is built around is narrower and harder. Within that environment, which single place is genuinely the most dangerous to a human being, and by what standard? Because the intuitive answer is wrong. Ask most people to point at the deadliest spot on a map of the Great Salt Lake and the finger goes toward open water. Deep, cold, far from a road, out past the last cell tower, the kind of place where you disappear and nobody finds you until spring. That instinct isn't crazy. It's just built on a mental model of a lake that this one has stopped being. 17 places counted down. Some are exactly where you'd expect. A couple are inside city limits. Before the list, the ruler. Danger isn't one quantity. It's at least two, and mixing them is how rankings turn into nonsense. The first is severity. If this place hurts you, how badly does it hurt you? A saturated brine pond at the far edge of a mineral works can kill a person who falls in and can't climb out. The second is exposure. How likely is an ordinary human being to actually be standing there? That same brine pond is behind a locked gate 40 miles from the nearest town, on private industrial ground patrolled by people whose entire job is keeping you off it. Multiply those two, and you get something close to real risk. Ignore either one, and you get theater. A ranking built purely on severity puts an old bombing range at the top and leaves it there, which is dramatic and useless, because roughly nobody goes to an old bombing range. A ranking built purely on exposure puts a parking lot at the top, which is honest and boring. The places worth talking about are the ones where both terms are meaningfully above zero at the same time. There's a third factor that keeps intruding, and it's better to name it now than to pretend it isn't there. Some of these hazards move. A cliff stays where you left it. A dust source does not. Over the last 3 decades, the shoreline of this lake has walked sideways across the valley floor, and every foot it retreated converted lake bottom into land, and some fraction of that new land into a surface that can be lifted into the air and delivered to somebody's lungs 11 miles away. That's a hazard with a delivery mechanism. Nothing else on this list has one. So the criterion is documented capacity to injure or kill, weighted by how likely an ordinary person is to be exposed to it, with extra weight for hazards that travel toward people instead of waiting for people to travel to them. Where the evidence is thin, the entry says so. Where a place is more frightening in reputation than in the incident record, it says that too, and it drops. There's also the question of dangerous to whom, and it deserves an answer up front because it changes several positions. The default subject here is an ordinary adult who lives in or visits northern Utah and who has no specialized training, no specialized equipment, and no particular reason to expect trouble. Not a soldier on a range, not a brine harvester in a boat in December, not a land speed racer. Those people all face real hazards in this basin, and they've all accepted them knowingly, which puts them in a different statistical category and makes their incidents poor evidence about anyone else's risk. Children matter separately, and where a hazard falls harder on them, the entry says so. Dogs matter too, more than people expect. And there are at least 2 places on this list where the animal is at meaningfully greater risk than its owner. And residents matter differently from visitors, because a visitor can leave. A word about what got left off, because the exclusions say as much about the ruler as the inclusions do. This lake has accumulated a substantial folklore inventory over 150 years, and none of it made the cut. There are 19th century newspaper accounts of a monster in the North Shore shallows, complete with a body described as part crocodile and part horse, which is the sort of detail that tends to appear in newspapers that were also selling excursion tickets. There's a persistent belief that the lake is biologically dead, which is spectacularly wrong, given that it feeds one of the largest bird staging concentrations in the hemisphere. There's the conviction that you cannot drown in water this salty, which is a comfortable thing to believe and has a mechanism problem that shows up later on this list. And there's the assumption that the rotten egg smell drifting into the valley on certain afternoons is the lake itself being disgusting, which turns out to have a much more specific and much more interesting source. Legend gets dropped. Places that are dangerous only to people doing something deliberately extreme get flagged and set aside, because a professional accepting a known risk is not the same statistical creature as a family in a rental car. And a place doesn't earn a position by being creepy, remote, or photogenic. It earns one by having an incident record, a measured contaminant, a documented mechanism of injury, or all 3. One more piece of bookkeeping. Almost everyone pictures this basin as a bowl of water with a shore around it. What's actually out there is a system of parts that behave completely differently from one another. And without the parts, half the list won't make sense. The lake is terminal. Water flows in and never flows out except as vapor. 3 rivers feed it. The Bear comes from the north and delivers the largest share. The Weber comes in from the east, and the Jordan arrives from the south, draining Utah Lake and running straight through the middle of the metropolitan area on its way. Everything those rivers carry, everything the surrounding mountains have ever eroded, everything the region's industry has ever put into the water, arrives here and stops. There is no downstream. Whatever came in is still here, sitting in the sediment. In 1959, the Southern Pacific replaced an aging wooden trestle with a rock-filled causeway running roughly 20 miles across the lake, from Promontory Point West to Lakeside. That embankment belongs to Union Pacific now, and it did something nobody fully anticipated. It cut the lake in 2. The southern side, Gilbert Bay, receives something like 95% of the incoming river water. The northern side, Gunnison Bay, receives almost none. Over the following decades, the North went hypersaline in a way that has few parallels anywhere on Earth, averaging around 317 grams of salt per liter since the mid-1960s, and frequently sitting right at the point where water simply cannot dissolve anymore. The South has averaged closer to 142. Same lake. Two chemistries. One rock embankment. That single engineering decision explains an enormous amount of what follows, including why one arm of this lake is the color of tomato soup and the other one isn't, and why a body of water that looks perfectly uniform from an airplane will treat you very differently depending on which side of the tracks you wade in from. Off the eastern edge, in the shallows, Imrishao, where the rivers actually arrive, sit two enormous bays that behave like estuaries. Bear River Bay in the north, Farmington Bay in the south. Fresh to brackish instead of briny, a couple of feet deep across most of their area, and they are the biological engine of the entire system. 10 to 12 million migratory birds pass through this basin every year, more than 230 species, using something like 400,000 acres of associated wetland. In 1991, the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network designated the lake a site of hemispheric importance, which is the highest tier they have. And to the west, past the last of the islands, the ground turns into something that stopped being a lake about 12,000 years ago and never got over it. The Great Salt Lake Desert, the Bonneville Salt Flats, the Silver Island Mountains, and an enormous slice of it that the Air Force uses to test things it does not want to test anywhere near a city, 17, Carrington Island. Start at the far end of the severity scale and the near zero end of the exposure scale, because that's where the ruler gets its first stress test. Carrington is about 1,200 acres of rock in the southwestern quadrant of the lake. The fourth largest island in the system. Its high point, Lambourne's Rock, reaches roughly 4,727 feet, named for a landscape painter whose relationship with these islands is worth a story of its own later on. The northwestern chunk of Carrington is privately owned by a ranching company out of Grantsville. The rest is public land under the Bureau of Land Management. Brine shrimp harvesters keep a radio repeater on the summit. It also has bomb craters. During the Second World War, the Army operated the Carrington Island Precision Bombing Range, and crews used the island as a target. Two of its geographic features are named for the Strategic Air Command, which tells you how long the arrangement lasted. When the range closed, the island was never cleaned up. It was too remote and too economically worthless to justify the expense, so whatever failed to detonate on impact stayed where it landed, under however much silt and salt crust has piled on since. Nobody has walked that ground systematically. There's no published clearance survey, no fenced exclusion zone, no warning sign at the trailhead, because there is no trailhead. Ordnance from that era doesn't become safe with age. In some respects, it becomes less predictable because the fusing degrades in ways that are hard to model from the outside. Severity, as high as anything on this list. Exposure, close to nothing. In an average year, the number of people who set foot on Carrington Island is probably in the low double digits, and most of them are there because of a boat, a permit, or an antenna. So it lands at 17, and the reason it's on the list at all is that the exposure term is no longer fixed. When the lake sat at its historic average, Carrington was an island. It required a boat. At the levels the lake has been running for the past several years, sandbars connect it toward Stansbury Island and, from there, toward the mainland, interrupted here and there by mineral company canals. The barrier that kept people off an abandoned bombing range for 80 years was water, and the water is leaving. One obvious question hangs over that. Why has nobody gone out and cleaned it up? Clearing ordnance from a site like that is slow, expensive work involving geophysical survey, controlled excavation, and disposal. And the cost per acre is high enough that agencies prioritize by risk to people. An island with no residents, no road, no infrastructure, and no realistic public access scores at the bottom of any such list, and it has scored there for 8 decades for entirely defensible reasons. The prioritization logic is sound. Its input assumption that the island is functionally unreachable is the part that has quietly expired. That's the shape of the argument. The structure repeats, and every time it repeats, the numbers get worse. 16. Fremont Island. Fremont is the third largest island in the lake. A little over 4,100 acres of grass, rock, and wind, about halfway up the eastern side. John C. Fremont and Kit Carson landed there in 1843 looking for fresh water and found none, which is how it picked up the nickname Disappointment Island. That name is doing a lot of honest work. There's no potable water on Fremont, no shade worth the word, no cell service reliable enough to plan around, and there's a sandbar. When the lake surface drops below roughly 4,194 feet, a bar of exposed sediment surfaces along the eastern side and connects the island toward the mainland near Promontory. The lake has spent most of the last several years below that mark. So the island that used to require a boat now looks, on satellite imagery, and in the accounts people trade with each other, like something you could reach on foot or in a vehicle. That perception is the hazard. The bar is not a road. It's saturated lake bed with a thin, dry crust on top, and the crust's thickness depends on how long that particular patch has been exposed and how much rain fell last week. A vehicle that breaks through doesn't sink dramatically. It settles to the frame, into material with roughly the consistency of wet cement and none of the drainage. Recovery means a specialized operator, hours of daylight, and a serious amount of money. The island's reputation, incidentally, was built on an episode that says a good deal about how people in this region have historically thought about it. In 1862, a Salt Lake City gravedigger was convicted of robbing the dead, stripping bodies of clothing and valuables over a period of years. The public reaction was volcanic. Authorities settled on banishment, and they carried it out by putting him on an island in the Great Salt Lake, using the water itself as a prison wall. Accounts differ on which island and on exactly what happened next. And the surviving records are thin enough that several versions circulate. What they agree on is that he was left there and was never accounted for afterward. That's a 19th century decision, and it rests on a 19th century assumption that an island in this lake is a place from which a person cannot leave. The assumption held for 160 years. It's the same assumption the Pelicans are making right now. And it's the assumption that a falling lake has quietly canceled. Meanwhile, the island itself is conservation ground now. It sold in November of 2020 to a foundation headed by a Salt Lake City philanthropist after an earlier plan to turn it into a motorized sports venue fell apart, and it was subsequently donated to the state's Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands with conservation easements held by the Nature Conservancy. Access is managed, which means a person stuck out there is stuck somewhere nobody is scheduled to be looking. The mechanism that kills people in that scenario isn't exotic. Heat, dehydration, and time, in that order, in a place with no water, no shade, and no reason for anyone to drive past. In summer, the surface of exposed playa runs substantially hotter than the air above it, and there is nothing on Fremont to break the sun between about 10 in the morning and 7 at night. Exposure is still low. This isn't a place with a visitor count, but it's measurably higher than Carrington and rising for exactly the same reason, which is why it sits one rung up, 15. The Silver Island Mountains and the far western desert. Drive west out of Salt Lake City on the interstate, and for about 90 miles, the landscape does something that people from wetter parts of the country find disorienting. It empties, not gradually. The mountains fall away on both sides, the ground goes flat and white. And the only vertical objects left are the mile markers and a sculpture somebody planted in the middle of the salt in the 1980s. Those low brown ridges hanging on the northwestern horizon are the Silver Island Mountains, and they wrap around the northern edge of the Bonneville Salt Flats like a parenthesis. They look close. They're a long way off, and the emptiness of the intervening ground destroys most people's ability to judge distance, because there's nothing of known size to compare against. A 62-year-old man from Sandy was found dead out there in mid-July. He'd been riding a side-by-side, became separated from it for reasons investigators couldn't reconstruct, and appears to have tried to walk back. The medical finding was heat exposure combined with a cardiac event. His vehicle was located separately afterward. That case repays a second look because it contains, in miniature, everything the western half of this basin does to people. Nothing about it required bad luck of an unusual kind. There was no flash flood, no fall, no animal, no crime. A man in a hot place became separated from his transportation and could not close a gap on foot that he could have closed in minutes with an engine. Ground temperatures on white salt and pale playa behave strangely. The surface reflects a great deal of the incoming sun, which is why the flats are blinding, but the air near that surface still stacks up heat, and the ambient reading at a weather station miles away in the shade doesn't describe what's happening around your ankles. Add zero shade, near zero humidity, and the fact that sweat evaporates so fast off exposed skin in that environment that people routinely fail to notice how much water they're losing, and dehydration arrives faster than the internal clock says it should. Distance is the other half. From the middle of that country, the nearest fuel is Wendover on the Nevada line. Cell coverage is patchy to non-existent once you leave the interstate corridor. The Tooele County Sheriff's Dispatch is the number that matters out there, and even after a call connects, a ground team has to physically cover terrain that took you an hour to cross in a vehicle designed for it. This ground has been doing the same thing to people for a very long time, and there's one crossing that documents it better than any modern incident report. In the late summer of 1846, a group of immigrant families heading for California took the advice of a promoter named Lansford Hastings, who had published a route across the Great Basin that he claimed would save hundreds of miles. Part of that route ran straight across the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings described the dry stretch as roughly 40 miles, 2 days, and nights of hard travel with no water. It was about 80 miles. It took them 6 days. What broke them wasn't the distance in the abstract, it was the surface. During the day, the moisture under the salt crust rose, and the crust turned to a gummy mass that swallowed wagon wheels to the hubs. Their water ran out completely after 3 days. Oxen went crazed with thirst. 9 of one family's 10 oxen broke loose and bolted into the desert and were never recovered. Other families lost cattle and horses. Some animals were so far gone they were simply left standing in their yokes beside abandoned wagons. The party that emerged from that crossing had lost a significant share of its transportation and most of its margin. The shortcut cost them something on the order of a month, and that month is the reason the name of that group, the Donner Party, is now attached to one of the grimmest episodes in the history of American westward migration. What happened to them in the Sierra Nevada that winter was the consequence of a delay, and a substantial portion of that delay was incurred right here, on ground that today has an interstate running across it at 80 miles an hour. The instructive part is that they had oxen, wagons, a plan, and hundreds of collective years of overland experience, and the desert still took most of their equipment. What it takes from a modern traveler is smaller only because a modern traveler is usually crossing it in 90 minutes with the air conditioning on. Step outside that envelope and the physics reverts. Severity in the West Desert is high, but slow. The place does not do anything violent to you. It simply removes options, one at a time, on a schedule set by the sun. Exposure is moderate, and this is where it earns a spot above the islands. People go out there on purpose, in numbers, for rock hounding, for shooting, for off-road riding, for the salt flats themselves, not a crowd, but not a dozen a year either. What holds it at 15 is that the hazard is legible. The desert announces itself. Nobody drives past Knowles thinking they've arrived somewhere forgiving. 14. The Bonneville Salt Flats. which is why the salt flats rank above the desert that contains them. They don't announce anything. They look like a parking lot the size of a county. The flats are the floor of the deepest, longest-lasting part of ancient Lake Bonneville, the freshwater sea that covered a fifth of Utah until it drained catastrophically about 17,000 years ago. What's left is roughly 30,000 acres of salt crust, close to perfectly level, hard enough in the right season to run a car across at speeds that would tear a normal road surface apart. That's the entire reason land speed racing exists here. The trouble is what's underneath, and how much the top layer varies. Under the salt is mud. Deep, saturated, structureless mud with no meaningful bearing capacity. The land managers who deal with the resulting mess describe the underlayer as effectively bottomless. And while that's shorthand more than geology, it's shorthand that captures the practical situation, which is that once you break through, there is no firm bottom within reach of a toe strap. The Bureau of Land Management has posted this repeatedly. The crust is thinnest at the edges. It's thinnest again in winter and spring, when the flats hold a shallow sheet of standing water and the salt goes soft. People drive out anyway, every year, often in rented vehicles, sometimes on a photo mission, occasionally on the theory that a truck with all-wheel drive can handle anything, which assumes the obstacle is traction. Traction has very little to do with it. Once the tires start spinning, the crust opens, and the vehicle settles until it's sitting on its frame in mud that grips like suction. Recovery runs in the neighborhood of $5,000, and that's when a recovery is even possible. There's a second and completely separate hazard here, which is the racing itself, and it needs separating clearly because it involves a different population and a different risk profile. Land speed racing at Bonneville is a small, extremely specialized activity with a long safety record and a small number of fatalities across decades. A motorcycle racer died there in 2016 at around 200 miles an hour. Another driver was killed in a crash roughly 2.5 miles into a run at close to 283. Both were experienced, both were doing something deliberately at the edge of the envelope, and neither death tells an ordinary visitor anything useful about their own risk. That distinction matters more than it might seem. A ranking that folds racing deaths into general visitor danger produces a number that looks alarming and describes nobody. The salt flats are dangerous to a casual visitor because of mud and heat and distance. They're dangerous to a racer because of physics at 3-digit speeds. Those are two different places occupying the same coordinates. The salt itself is also in worse shape than it looks, and that matters for safety, not only for racing. The crust has thinned substantially over the decades. Racers and researchers have both documented a shrinking usable racing surface, and the causes under discussion include groundwater pumping for nearby potash extraction, changes in the local hydrology, and long-term climate. There's an ongoing program to return salt brine to the flats in an effort to rebuild the crust, and there's real scientific disagreement about how well it's working. For a visitor, the practical consequence of a thinning crust is that the margin between a surface that holds and a surface that doesn't has narrowed. Ground that was reliably solid 2 decades ago may not be now, and there is no way to evaluate it by looking, which is why the guidance from the land managers has converged on something simple. If the surface is wet, or if you can see standing water anywhere on it, stay off it entirely, including on foot, and stay on the established access area near the rest stop. Wet salt gives no warning before it opens. Exposure at Bonneville is high by the standards of this list. The rest area off the interstate pulls in a steady stream of travelers, and a meaningful fraction of them drive out onto the salt because there's no gate and no obvious reason not to. 13. Stansbury Island and the southwestern mudflats. Now the mud stops being a footnote and becomes the entry. Stansbury is the second largest island in the lake, a mountain about 11 miles long on the southwestern side, close enough to the interstate that people can and do make a spontaneous decision to go look at it. It's connected to the mainland by a dirt causeway that runs between Mineral Company evaporation ponds, which means the drive out there passes through an industrial landscape that most visitors read as scenery. There's a mountain bike trail on the island. There are petroglyphs. There's a hike up to a summit above 6,000 feet, with a view down the length of the lake that is legitimately one of the better payoffs in northern Utah. And around all of it, on the west and south sides especially, there is Mud Flat. The drive out is its own small lesson in how this basin misleads people. The dirt causeway runs through an industrial landscape of dikes and rectangular ponds, some of which are bright pink, and visitors routinely stop to photograph them under the impression that they're looking at a natural phenomenon. What they're looking at is the intake end of a mineral works. That misreading is harmless in itself, but it sets the frame for the rest of the visit, because a person who has already classified an industrial installation as scenery is primed to classify a mud flat as a beach. Great Salt Lake mud deserves its own paragraph, because people consistently underestimate it, and the underestimation follows a predictable script. From a standing position, it looks like beach. It's flat, it's uniform, it's the color of wet concrete, and there's often a dry crust on top that holds weight for the first several steps. Then, the crust gives, and the material underneath is a fine, saturated, oxygen-poor silt that behaves like a non-Newtonian fluid. Slow, steady pull, and it grips. Fast pull, and it grips harder. The atmospheric scientist who spent years mapping the exposed lake bed did most of that work on a fat tire bicycle, riding hundreds of miles across the playa, and he chose that method partly because a bicycle spreads weight across a wide contact patch and can be dragged out when it does bog. That's a researcher with a plan. The average person is out there in sneakers. What actually happens to people is rarely dramatic and almost never fatal by itself. You go into mid-calf or mid-thigh. Your shoes come off in the mud, which sounds trivial and is not, because now you're barefoot on a salt crust that cuts and a surface that will burn skin at midday. Getting out takes an enormous amount of energy, and the geometry of the situation is nasty in a specific way. The mudflats are widest exactly where the lake is shallowest, which means the walk from firm ground to actual water can run for hundreds of yards, and people commit to that walk without realizing that every yard out is a yard they'll have to earn back. The specific physics explains why brute force is the wrong tool here. Fine saturated silt with a foot in it forms a seal. Pulling straight up tries to create a void underneath the foot, and the surrounding mud has to flow into that void for the foot to come free, which it does very slowly because the particles are fine, and the water between them can't move fast. Pull harder, and you increase the pressure differential without changing the flow rate. Meanwhile, the material grips around the ankle and shin over a large surface area, so the force required climbs quickly. This is why the effort involved scales so badly with depth. Ankle deep is an inconvenience. Knee deep is a workout. Thigh deep, with 2 feet sealed and nothing solid to brace against, is a situation where a fit adult can burn through an alarming amount of energy, making very little progress, in full sun, a long way from the car. The mud isn't what hurts them. The exhaustion is. Layer distance on top. The southwestern shore has no lifeguards, no ranger station, no regular patrol, and in most places, no other people. A person who exhausts themselves in mudflat at 2 in the afternoon in August is in a bad position. And the bad part isn't the mud. It's the heat and the isolation that the mud has now trapped them in. Severity here sits in the moderate band. Mud alone doesn't kill healthy people. What earns Stansbury the 13th position is the combination: an easy access road, an appealing destination, a hazard that presents itself as a beach, and nobody around when the misjudgment compounds. Compare it to Fremont Island, 2 rungs down. Fremont is more remote, and more lethal if things go badly, but almost nobody goes. Stansbury is less lethal and far more visited. Under the criterion, the second one outranks the first, and that's the criterion working the way it was designed to. 12. Gunnison Island. Here the ruler gets bent, because Gunnison is the one entry on this list where the primary danger runs in the other direction. The place is not especially likely to hurt you. You are extremely likely to hurt it. And the reason that lands on a danger ranking at all is that the state has responded by making the island one of the most legally hazardous pieces of ground in the basin to be caught standing on. Gunnison sits in the far northwestern quadrant, in the hypersaline arm, about 160 acres of rock, with almost nothing growing on it. For most of the last century, it has hosted one of the largest American white pelican breeding colonies in western North America. Historically, something on the order of 20,000 breeding adults, which by the standard estimates is a substantial slice of the entire species. Pelicans nest there specifically because it's unreachable. They fly a considerable distance to feed at freshwater marshes and come back to a rock that no predator can get to. Worth pausing on what that arrangement actually costs the birds, because it explains why disturbance matters so much more here than it would somewhere else. American white pelicans are enormous, with wingspans over 9 feet, and they don't feed in hypersaline water, because there's nothing in hypersaline water for them to eat. So the adults commute. They fly from Gunnison out to freshwater marshes and reservoirs, in some cases well over 50 miles each way, feed, and fly back to a rock in the middle of a salt sea to regurgitate for chicks that can't yet regulate their own temperature. That's the entire strategy, and it only works because the rock is unreachable. Every element of it, the commute, the exposure, the timing, is calibrated against an assumption of absolute isolation. The island has been tested against that assumption before. In 1895, a painter and writer named Alfred Lambourne homesteaded there, spending a winter alone trying to establish a vineyard on a rock with no fresh water. He produced a book about the experience, and no grapes. Crews also worked the island at various points to sift accumulated bird droppings for fertilizer, and the pelicans left while they were there. Except that a rock in a lake stops being a rock in a lake when the lake goes down. Falling water levels have been building land bridges to the islands of the Great Salt Lake for decades. And Gunnison's is the consequential one. Coyotes have been documented crossing since at least 2017, when trail cameras picked them up exploring the island. The colony responded by compressing into the most defensible bays in the northwestern corner. Between 2014 and 2023, pelican numbers at the lake dropped by more than half, with nesting counts averaging around 8,500. In 2023, an aerial survey confirmed the birds had abandoned the colony entirely that season. They came back in 2024, and they also turned up on Hat Island, a much smaller island to the south, for the first time since 1943, about 1,300 of them. 81 years is a long gap in a bird's institutional memory, and biologists took the return as a sign that the colony is looking for options. So access to Gunnison is closed, fully closed, with a 1-mile buffer that applies to boats, aircraft, and every other form of approach. American white pelicans are known to abandon nests over disturbance that a person would consider trivial, and abandonment in that heat means the eggs cook. The options for fixing this are all bad, which is why nothing has been fixed. You can't put a fence across a shifting bar in a lake. Removing predators from an island the size of a farm is possible and has been done elsewhere, but it's expensive. It has to be repeated whenever the bridge reopens, and it raises its own complications. Raising the lake would solve it permanently and requires solving the largest water policy problem in the interior West. So the practical response has been monitoring, cameras, banding programs, aerial surveys, and a strict exclusion zone, which is a way of controlling the one variable anyone can actually control, which is us. Why does a closed island rank above a mudflat then? because the ruler is exposure times consequence, and the consequence side here includes consequences that don't land on the visitor. A person who walks a land bridge to Gunnison during nesting season and spooks the colony causes a scale of harm that no amount of personal caution mitigates, and they do it without a single sign, fence, or physical barrier to stop them, because the barrier used to be 12 feet of brine, and now, some years, it isn't. The exposure term is climbing for the worst possible reason, and the entry stays at 12 only because the number of people who would attempt that walk remains small. 11. Gunnison Bay, the North Arm. Cross the causeway, and the chemistry changes so completely that you're effectively looking at a different body of water wearing the same name. The North Arm receives almost no river inflow. It's fed mainly by brine exchange, through the causeway, and by whatever falls out of the sky. Since the mid-1960s, it has averaged around 317 grams of dissolved salt per liter, and it spends a lot of its time saturated, meaning the water is holding all the salt it physically can, and any additional salt precipitates out as crystal. For scale, the open ocean runs around 35 grams per liter. This is close to 10 times that. Water that dense does things to a human body that catch people off guard. The buoyancy is the famous part, and it's real. A person floats high in North Arm brine, so high that swimming in any normal sense becomes awkward, because your legs and hips ride at the surface, and your usual stroke doesn't reach anything. That produces the persistent local folklore that you cannot drown in the Great Salt Lake. You can. Buoyancy keeps you at the surface, it doesn't keep the water out of your airway, and the water going in is the problem. Brine that concentrated is intensely irritating to the throat and lungs. It triggers coughing and gagging, and a person who inhales it while panicking is in serious trouble, regardless of how well they're floating. Drownings in this lake are rare, but rare is a different word than impossible, and the historical record includes them going back to the 1880s. Then there's the part nobody warns you about, which is what saturated brine does to skin, eyes, and equipment. Salt draws water out of tissue by osmosis. Any cut, scrape, or shaving nick becomes memorable within seconds. Eyes react badly enough that people who get splashed reliably describe it as the worst part of the experience. And when you come out and the water evaporates, you don't dry off, you crust over, and the crust holds enough salt against the skin to keep working. None of that is lethal. What makes the North Arm genuinely dangerous is the total absence of anything resembling a rescue system. There's no marina on that side. No lifeguards, no patrol boats, no channel markers. Water depth over enormous stretches of it runs a few feet, which sounds safe and instead means most boats can't get to you either. When engineers finally cut an opening through the causeway in 2016, one of the stated reasons was to restore rescue boat access to the Northern Arm, which is a quiet way of admitting that for decades there effectively wasn't any. Wind is the accelerant. This is a shallow lake in a wide open basin with mountain ranges funneling air down onto it, and shallow water builds steep, close-together waves very quickly. It can go from glass to dangerous in under an hour, and in a dense brine that already resists normal swimming, that's a poor combination. The North Arm's shoreline needs its own note here because it's the emptiest inhabited adjacent coastline in the interior West, and because of what people keep proposing to do with it. The eastern anchor of the causeway is Promontory Point, the tip of a long peninsula reaching south into the lake. 30 miles north of that tip is Promontory Summit, which is where the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific met on the 10th of May, 1869, and drove the ceremonial spike that completed the first transcontinental railroad. The two promontories get confused constantly, including by people who live in Utah. There's a nice irony in the geography. The reason Promontory Summit stopped mattering is the lake. In 1904, the railroad built the Loosen Cutoff, a wooden trestle running straight across the water instead of the long climb around the northern end. and the original transcontinental alignment through the summit went quiet almost overnight. The rock causeway that replaced that trestle in 1959 is the same embankment now dividing the lake's chemistry in half. One engineering decision made the Golden Spike site a backwater. Its successor made the North Arm a brine pit. Neither outcome was on anybody's drawing board. Today, the northern shoreline runs for tens of miles with essentially nothing on it. Lakeside is a rail siding. There are no towns, no fuel, no services, and a great deal of exposed bed, which is precisely why it keeps attracting proposals for things nobody wants nearby. A company holds a permitted landfill on the Promontory Peninsula, authorized for hundreds of millions of tons of waste. Positioned a few hundred feet from the lakeshore, and has repeatedly sought state approval to accept industrial waste shipped in from around the country, including coal ash. Coal ash is federally regulated because of what's in it, and the list includes arsenic, cadmium, and mercury. One application was withdrawn in 2018 when it became clear the state was likely to deny it. A later attempt drew a state-commissioned review concluding the company had failed to demonstrate that Utah needs another large landfill of that class. County officials have also worked to block it. That fight is ongoing, and this isn't the place to litigate it. What it illustrates is a structural pressure that runs through the entire top half of this list. Remote, cheap, unpopulated ground next to a migratory bird corridor is exactly the ground that industrial siting decisions gravitate toward, and the calculation those decisions rest on treats the lake as a fixed boundary, which it has never once been. Anything placed on that shoreline with the assumption that the water will stay where it is has made a bet on a variable that has moved more than 20 feet within living memory. 10. Rosal Point. The North Arm hazard becomes an actual danger ranking entry at exactly one place, because there's exactly one place where ordinary people show up on that shoreline in numbers, and it is the least likely tourist destination in the American West. In 1970, an artist named Robert Smithson built a coil of black basalt 1,500 feet long and about 15 feet wide, spiraling counterclockwise out into the water at Rosal Point on the North Arm's northeastern shore. Spiral Jetty spent roughly 30 years underwater and invisible. It reappears whenever the lake drops below about 4,198 feet, which is to say it has been fully exposed and dry for most of this century, sitting in a crust of white salt on a red lake. It's free, it's open, and it's on every list of things to see in Utah, which means a steady flow of people who have never driven a dirt road in their lives now point a rental car at a place that is, by any practical measure, backcountry. The last stretch of the approach runs about 16 miles on unpaved surface, washboard gravel in the good sections. High clearance is strongly recommended, four-wheel drive more so. There is no fuel, no water, no bathroom, no shade, and no cell service. When it rains, the road turns to the same clay slick that makes the rest of this basin dangerous, and vehicles that got in fine do not get out fine. The site itself adds two things. The first is that the shoreline there is exactly the North Arm brine described a moment ago, and people wade in because the water is pink and the salt crystals are beautiful, and nothing about the place says stop. The second is the tar. Rosal Point sits on natural petroleum seeps, and heavy black crude has been oozing to the surface there since long before anybody named the place. Prospectors drilled it in the early 1900s and never got a commercial well out of it, and the equipment they abandoned sat rusting on the shoreline for decades. The wells have since been capped, and the site was cleaned up in the early 2000s. What remains is geological. Dark, viscous tar seeping up through the ground, softening to something like warm asphalt in summer heat, and holding on to anything that steps into it. The seeps have a longer commercial history than most visitors realize, and it's a history of failure. Prospectors identified oil at Rosal Point in the early 1900s and drilled it repeatedly over several decades. The crude is heavy, high in sulfur, and difficult to move, and no operation there ever produced at commercial scale. What the drilling left behind was equipment: pilings, pipe, a jetty, and at one point an abandoned amphibious landing craft rusting on the shore, which was part of the strange industrial junkyard the artist found when he chose the site. The wells have since been plugged and the ground remediated. That's part of why the place holds up as something more than a photo stop. Somebody looked at a failed oil field on a dead sea in a place with no road worth the name and decided it was the right location for a permanent artwork. The material for the spiral came off the shoreline itself, black basalt from the local rock moved by dump truck and front loader over several days. The failure pattern out there is boringly consistent. People underestimate the drive, arrive later than planned, spend longer at the site than intended because the place is arresting, and then start back toward pavement with less daylight and less fuel than they'd have chosen. Add a flat tire or a rain shower that turns 16 miles of clay into a skating rink, and a pleasant afternoon becomes a night in a car with no phone signal and nobody expecting them. Nothing about that sequence requires a bad decision. It requires 4 ordinary ones stacked in a place with no margin. Severity at Rosal Point is low. Almost nobody gets seriously hurt there. Exposure, though, is high and rising. And the specific failure mode is a mismatch between how the destination is marketed and what it physically is. This is a remote, roadless, waterless, serviceless piece of hypersaline shoreline that shows up in travel guides next to national parks with staffed visitor centers. It ranks 10th on the strength of that mismatch alone. 9. Gilbert Bay and the Great Salt Lake Marina. The South Arm is the one people mean when they say the Great Salt Lake. It holds the overwhelming majority of the freshwater inflow. It holds the brine shrimp. It holds the recreation. And it's the arm that touches the metropolitan area. And it's the arm where the lake actually gets people into trouble on the water. On a September evening in 2019, 3 20-year-old kayakers went out from the South Shore. The weather turned. Waves in the neighborhood of 7 feet built up, which in a lake averaging around 15 feet deep means short, steep, breaking water. Nothing like the long swell of a big lake. The 3 got separated. One made shore on Antelope Island and called for help at 7:30 in the evening. The search that followed pulled in state park rangers plus responders from Davis, Toole, and Weber counties, along with the Department of Public Safety with boats, ground units, and helicopters. The second kayaker was found on the west side of the island just after midnight. The third turned up around 1:30 in the morning. Both went to the hospital for evaluation. Everyone lived, and that's exactly why the case is instructive. It shows what a bad afternoon on Gilbert Bay costs: 4 counties worth of emergency response, aircraft, and most of a night, for 3 people who did nothing more reckless than paddling on a lake. Cold is the underrated part. The lake doesn't freeze in the South Arm under normal conditions because the salt depresses the freezing point, which people take as a sign that the water is warm. It isn't. Winter water temperatures sit near freezing while remaining liquid, and immersion in water that cold produces gasp reflex, then rapidly declining hand function, then hypothermia, on a timeline measured in tens of minutes. At a salt concentration around 140 grams per liter, which is roughly 4 times seawater, and you get an environment where the buoyancy that keeps you floating also keeps you from swimming efficiently toward shore. The physiology deserves precision, because cold water immersion follows a sequence that people consistently get wrong. Hypothermia sits at the end of that sequence, and 3 other things happen first. On entry into near freezing water, the body produces an involuntary gasp, followed by a minute or 2 of uncontrolled rapid breathing. And that's the interval where most cold water deaths actually occur, because a gasp underwater fills an airway. If a person gets past that, the next problem is that hands and forearms lose useful function within about 10 minutes, well before core temperature drops meaningfully. So the ability to grab a line, hold a boat, or work a zipper disappears long before the ability to think does. Actual hypothermia arrives later, on a scale of tens of minutes to an hour or more depending on body size and clothing. Stack that sequence against a lake where the water is dense enough to interfere with a normal swimming stroke. The waves are short and steep. The shore may be a mile of shallow mud flat with no beach to climb out onto, and it's November. That's the combination that turns a manageable capsize into a rescue operation. Then there's the marina, and the marina is a story about the shoreline moving. Great Salt Lake State Park sits on the south shore, and its harbor has been fighting the water level for years. Boat ramps have been closed for low water, sailboats have been pulled from the water and stored on land because there wasn't enough depth to float them. Dredging has become a recurring expense, most recently to keep a channel open primarily for state boats used in public safety and research work. A person can drive to a marina, look at a harbor, and reasonably conclude that a harbor implies water. The gap between what the infrastructure implies and what the lake currently is has become a hazard in its own right, and there's a working population on this water that almost nobody outside Utah knows exists. Every autumn and winter, boats go out onto Gilbert Bay to harvest brine shrimp cysts. Brine shrimp produce a dormant egg with a hard shell that floats, and in the right conditions those cysts accumulate into visible streaks on the surface, sometimes miles long. Crews boom them, pump them aboard, and deliver them to processors. The product goes to aquaculture operations around the world as feed for shrimp and fish larvae, and in a normal year the harvest runs into the tens of millions of pounds. It's a genuine commercial fishery on a lake most people assume is dead. It's also a winter operation on shallow, cold, hypersaline water, run in small boats, often far from shore, in a season with short daylight and unpredictable wind, on a lake where the marina has been struggling with depth for years. The people who do it know the water better than anyone else on this list, which is exactly why their experience is worth citing. They treat the lake as a serious working environment, never as a novelty, and they run their operations accordingly. The industry also happens to function as an early warning system for the whole basin. In the year the South Arm's salinity spiked, cyst production fell hard, and the harvest came in millions of pounds below normal. That's a commercial number, tracked annually for economic reasons, and it doubles as a readout of whether the food web is still working. So why does Gilbert Bay rank at 9, above Rosal Point at 10? Because the failure modes are worse. At Rosal Point, people get stuck, sunburned, and irritated. On Gilbert Bay, people get separated from their boats in cold, dense water with the wind rising and dark coming. And the difference between that turning out fine and turning out otherwise is a matter of how fast a helicopter can get airborne. Everything up to this point has been the lake as a place. From here down, the ranking is mostly about the lake as a process, and the process needs explaining before the top 8 make any sense at all. A terminal lake is an accounting problem. Water comes in from rivers, streams, groundwater, and direct precipitation. Water leaves by evaporating off the surface. That's the whole ledger. There's no outlet, no dam to open, no downstream user to shut off. When inflow exceeds evaporation, the lake rises and spreads out across a very flat bed, which increases surface area, which increases evaporation, which pushes back toward balance. When inflow falls short, the same geometry works in reverse and works fast. The reason the lake sits where it does today is that the inflow side of that ledger has been shrinking for well over a century, and the shrinking accelerated. Water gets taken out of the tributaries before it arrives. Agriculture takes the largest share by a wide margin, mostly for irrigated hay and pasture in the valleys upstream. Cities and industry take a growing share. Mineral extraction operations pump lake water directly. Reservoirs upstream hold back spring runoff. Every one of those uses is legal, most of them are old, and collectively they intercept a meaningful fraction of what the Bear, the Weber, and the Jordan would otherwise deliver. The scale of the shift shows up clearly in the state's own tracking. Between the late 1980s and the early 2020s, total depletions across the basin rose by something like 14%. Agriculture's share of that total dropped from roughly 3/4 to about 2/3, while the municipal and industrial share climbed from around 1/6 to more than 1/4. Residential depletion alone jumped by about 60% since 2001, and the majority of that is outdoor water. Lawns. The lake is competing with lawns and losing in a desert. Reduced stream flow accounts for roughly 2/3 of the volume the lake has lost. The rest comes from the other side of the ledger, as warmer conditions push evaporation up. This basin has swung hard in both directions within living memory, which is part of why the danger is easy to dismiss. On the 3rd of June, 1986, the lake hit 4,211.5 feet and covered something like 2,300 square miles. It was flooding the interstate, threatening the airport, drowning the causeway out to Antelope Island under 8 feet of water, and inundating a national wildlife refuge so thoroughly that the refuge's headquarters was destroyed. The state's response was one of the strangest infrastructure projects in American water management. 3 enormous pumps installed near Hogup, about 13 miles west of Lakeside, lifting brine out of the North Arm into a canal roughly 4 miles long that spilled it westward into a shallow depression beyond the Newfoundland Mountains. They ran from the 1st of April, 1987, through the end of June, 1989, moved something like 2.2 million acre-feet of water, cost about $60 million, and contributed a little over 2 feet to a total decline of about 5. The rest of the drop was weather. Those pumps still exist. They've been maintained on and off against the possibility of another flood cycle, which is a decision that looks either prudent or absurd depending on which decade you evaluate it in. 36 years after that record high, the same lake bottomed out more than 23 feet lower. A very large snowpack in 2023, plus an emergency order to raise a berm at the causeway so the South Arm could hold onto its water instead of bleeding it north, bought several feet back. The berm went up by about 5 feet over its previous level, and the south end came up nearly 4 feet in a season. Then the gains started leaking away again. The state considers 4,198 feet the minimum healthy elevation for the South Arm. The 2025 water year closed at about 4,191, the third lowest reading in a record spanning more than 120 years. As of this summer, the gauge at Saltaire is reading around 4,190. That is roughly 7.5 feet below healthy, and the scientific team advising the legislature estimates that returning the lake to a healthy elevation on any reasonable timeline would take an additional 800,000 acre-feet of water arriving every single year sustained, so the bed stays exposed. Which brings up the question that actually drives the top of this list. What is that bed made of? Two things mixed together in proportions that vary enormously depending on where you're standing. The first is geology. The mountains around this basin are mineralized. Arsenic in particular has been arriving here through rivers and erosion since long before anyone was mining anything. And the sediment core work supports that. Arsenic stays elevated in submerged sediment as well as exposed sediment, which points at a source that isn't a smokestack. That's not a reason to relax. It means the problem doesn't have an owner you can sue and doesn't go away when a plant closes. The second is 160 years of industry. Smelters ran along the southern shore for generations. Copper refining, magnesium production, and mineral extraction all operate on or beside the lake right now. Municipal wastewater from a metropolitan area discharges into the eastern bays. everything any of those operations released into the air or the water eventually settled here, because in a terminal basin, there is nowhere else for it to go. That's why lead, copper, zinc, and mercury show up in the sediment record with a very different spatial pattern than arsenic, concentrated near the places that produced them. Now the crucial part, and it's the piece most coverage of this subject gets wrong. 800 square miles of exposed lakebed does not mean 800 square miles of dust. Most of the playa is protected by a natural salt crust, a hard rind that forms as brine wicks up and evaporates. Intact crust is remarkably good at holding sediment down. The researcher who mapped this ground by bicycle found that only about 9% of the exposed bed was actually emitting dust, roughly 43,000 acres, concentrated in specific hotspots where the crust had been broken. Broken by wheels, by hooves, by boots, by wind scour, by wetting and drying cycles. That's the mechanism, and it cuts both ways. It means the situation is not as bad as the raw acreage suggests. It also means the situation is fragile in a way that acreage doesn't capture, because a crust is a thin thing, and once it's broken, the sediment underneath is loose and available and stays that way. The way that mapping was done deserves a moment because it's a good example of research that couldn't be done any other way. Satellites can tell you where sediment is exposed. They can't tell you whether the crust on any given acre is intact, cracked, powdery, or already gone, and that distinction is the entire question. So the work got done at ground level. On a bicycle with oversized tires, riding transect after transect across a surface that will not support a truck and will not support a walking human for very long either. Hundreds of miles of it, sampling as he went, building a map of which acres are sealed and which acres are loaded and ready. What that produced is a hotspot map, and the hotspots are not evenly distributed. They cluster where the crust has been mechanically broken and where the sediment underneath is fine-grained enough to be lifted by wind that a person would describe as merely breezy. A crust that has never been driven on can sit through a gale and hold. The same sediment, once the seal is broken, starts moving at wind speeds that occur on ordinary afternoons. That distinction is the single most actionable fact in this entire subject, and it's the one that gets lost in coverage that leads with the total exposed acreage. Protecting crust is cheap. Restoring it is not. What comes off those hotspots has been characterized in some detail, and the characterization is not reassuring. A chemical engineering team at the University of Utah developed a method for dissolving metals out of dust particles using progressively more aggressive acids, essentially asking not just how much metal is in the dust, but how much of it can actually get loose inside a body. The lakebed dust released more bioavailable metal than the researchers expected, and more than other major regional dust sources. Compared against dust from the West Desert and other playas that also blow into this valley, the Great Salt Lake material came back more chemically reactive and more toxic. A separate line of work looked at what that dust does to lungs directly. In laboratory exposures using animal and cell models, respirable Great Salt Lake dust produced inflammatory responses at lower doses than several reference particles that everybody already agrees are bad news, including coal fly ash, wood smoke, cigarette smoke, and diesel exhaust. The specific findings included an influx of inflammatory cells, fluid accumulation in lung tissue, and elevated expression of a gene tied to airway obstruction and the kind of hypersensitivity seen in asthma. Those are animal and cell results, and translating them into human risk numbers is genuinely unfinished work. What they establish is a direction, and the direction is that this particular dust punches above its weight. The lake's biology has been running its own experiment in parallel. Salinity in the South Arm climbed as the water dropped, reaching about 185 grams per liter in November of 2022. The algae and cyanobacteria at the base of this food web start failing somewhere around 180. Brine shrimp, which are the reason 10 million birds bother coming here, do their best between roughly 75 and 160. That year, hatch rates fell to around 60%, and the commercial cyst harvest came in something like 6 to 11 million pounds below normal. Meanwhile, the microbialites were drying out. These are the lumpy calcium carbonate mounds that carpet large areas of the lake bottom, built by microbial communities, and they function as the anchor points where brine flies lay eggs and complete their life cycle. In the summer and autumn of 2022, roughly 40% of the microbialite reef area was sitting in open air. Exposed microbialites bleach from green to white and stop producing. And underneath all of it, in the deepest parts of the South Arm, there's a layer that matters. Dense brine bleeding south through the causeway sinks to the bottom and forms a distinct stratum that doesn't mix with the water above it. It has no dissolved oxygen at all. Anoxic. Sulfur-rich conditions like that are precisely what bacteria need to convert ordinary mercury into methylmercury, which is the form that accumulates up a food chain. Researchers found high methylmercury concentrations in that deep brine layer. Biologists found elevated mercury in waterfowl using the lake, and the state issued consumption advisories for certain duck species in 2005. When the causeway culverts were sealed in December of 2013, the deep brine layer dissipated within about 6 months. When a new bridge opening restored circulation in December of 2016, it came back. One more consequence, and it's the one that surprises people who assumed a shrinking lake was purely somebody else's problem. This body of water manufactures snow. Cold air moving across a large, relatively warm, unfrozen surface picks up moisture and drops it when it hits the mountains on the far side. And the Wasatch Range, Wasatch sits directly in that path. Lake effect events contribute a meaningful share of the snow that falls on the canyons above Salt Lake City. And because the lake water is salty and unusually dense, the snow it produces has a reputation for being exceptionally dry. That reputation is on the state's license plates. It's the basis of a ski industry worth well over $1 billion a year, and it's a substantial part of why Salt Lake City has hosted one Winter Olympics and will host another. Less lake surface means less moisture available to that mechanism. Researchers studying this have been careful about the magnitude. Because lake effect is only one contributor to the region's snowpack, and separating it from ordinary storm track precipitation is difficult. But the direction of the effect is not in dispute, and it closes a loop that ought to be uncomfortable for anyone in the basin. The snowpack in those mountains is where the water comes from that would refill the lake. A smaller lake makes less snow, and less snow makes a smaller lake. That's the process. A shrinking terminal lake, a bed made of natural mineralization plus industrial legacy, a fragile crust holding most of it down, a small fraction of hot spots doing most of the emitting, and a wind pattern that points at 2.5 million people. Everything from here on is ranked with that machinery running in the background. 8. The Utah Test and Training Range and the restricted western edge. The western boundary of this basin gets drawn on aeronautical charts and enforced by the United States Air Force. No ridgeline marks it, no state line coincides with it, and it covers a piece of ground large enough that most people have trouble holding it in their heads. The Utah Test and Training Range begins roughly 80 miles west of Salt Lake City and takes in about 2,675 square miles of surface. The airspace above and around it exceeds 19,000 square miles. It is the largest continuous block of overland supersonic authorized restricted airspace anywhere in the lower 48 states, which is a specific way of saying this is where the country tests things that cannot be tested over a populated area. The range splits into a northern and a southern half, divided by the interstate. Cruise missiles get flown here. Ordnance gets dropped here. An Air Force representative once summarized the range's history by noting that just about every munition out there has been tested on it. The northern portion includes a disposal and open burn area where explosives of very large yield can be detonated, and it holds a permit for that work that no other site in the country holds. Then, immediately adjacent, there's Dugway Proving Ground, which is the Army side of the same general enterprise, and Wendover Airfield on the Nevada line, where crews trained for the atomic missions of 1945. This whole quadrant of Utah has been a national weapons laboratory for 80 years, and the reason it was chosen is precisely the reason it's on this list. Nobody lived there, and the ground was already dead. And there's one episode out of that quadrant that belongs in any honest assessment of what restricted ground can do to the people living beside it. On the 13th of March, 1968, an aircraft flying out of Dugway conducted an open-air dispersal test of a nerve agent called VX. One of the dispensers failed to empty completely, and as the aircraft climbed away, the remaining agent leaked and drifted. It came down in Skull Valley, roughly 27 miles from the test site, on grazing land. Within days, sheep in that valley were dying. The total is usually cited at somewhere between 6,000 and 6,400 animals, though the Proving Ground's own safety office counted a lower figure of about 3,800 carcasses. The Army acknowledged that open-air testing had occurred. For decades afterward, it declined to accept responsibility for the deaths. In 1998, a report from 1970 was declassified. It described the chemical evidence as incontrovertible and concluded that the quantity of agent involved was sufficient to account for the deaths. Investigators had found residue in snow and grass samples collected 3 weeks after the event. The public reaction to Skull Valley fed directly into the decision, announced in 1969. To halt open-air chemical weapons testing in the United States. Whatever else that episode was, it was the thing that ended a category of experiment. It's on this list because it establishes the character of the hazard rather than the current level of it. Open-air agent testing stopped more than half a century ago. What did not stop is the fact that the western edge of this basin is ground where the government has, for 80 years, conducted the experiments it could not conduct anywhere else, and where the residue of those decades is distributed across an area larger than several states, unfenced across most of its perimeter. For an ordinary person, the danger here is almost entirely about boundaries. And boundaries in country like this are hard to perceive. There are signs. There are also hundreds of miles of unfenced desert perimeter, where the sign is a quarter mile away over a rise. And the only thing marking the line is a change in the map on your phone, assuming your phone has signal, which it likely doesn't. People wander in. Rockhounds, hunters, off-road riders, and people following a 2-track road that looked like it went somewhere. What happens next is usually detention and a serious conversation, not injury. But the surface itself carries residue that no amount of good intentions fixes. Ranges that have absorbed decades of live ordnance retain a percentage of items that failed to function, and an object that failed to function is an object whose internal state is unknown. Handling one, moving one, or lighting a campfire on top of one are all bad ideas with permanent consequences. One piece of this quadrant is open to the public, and the contrast is instructive. At Wendover, on the Nevada line, the old airfield survives in a partially restored state. It's where the crews who flew the atomic missions of 1945 trained, in secrecy, on a base that was chosen for the same reason as everything else out here. Nobody would notice. You can walk parts of it. There are hangars, a control tower, and a great deal of concrete going back to sagebrush. The reason that matters here is that Wendover demonstrates the ordinary end of this landscape's history, the end with interpretive signs and a parking lot, and it sits a few miles from ground where none of that applies. The transition between those two conditions is not marked in any way a person driving a dirt track would notice. Severity extreme. Exposure low but real, and much less controllable than a locked gate implies, because the perimeter is the size of a small state. There's a wrinkle here that connects the military ground back to the lake, and it's the reason this entry sits at 8 rather than lower. The western edge of the Great Salt Lake and the eastern edge of the range overlap in the general vicinity of the lake's southwestern shore. As the lake recedes, the walkable, drivable, and rideable surface expands in that direction. The exposed bed is a highway. It's flat, it's firm in the dry season, and it doesn't have fences on it because until recently it was underwater. 7. The evaporation pond complexes. Fly over the southern and eastern margins of this lake, and the shoreline stops being a shoreline and becomes a grid. Rectangles, some of them a mile or more on a side, separated by dikes, colored everything from pale green to deep magenta depending on what's dissolved in them and which organisms are currently thriving. From altitude, they read as decorative. On the ground, they are industrial process equipment operating at the scale of geography. The colors have an explanation, and it's biological. In the moderately salty ponds, a green alga called Dunaliella dominates, and the water reads green. Push the concentration higher, and the alga shifts to producing carotenoid pigments, the same family of compounds that make carrots orange, as a kind of sunscreen. Push it higher still, and salt-loving archaea take over, and their cell membranes contain a pigment that turns the water anything from rose to deep magenta. So the color of any given rectangle is a readout of its salinity, which is a readout of where it sits in the harvest cycle. The whole grid is a chemical process, with its progress bar visible from the air. The Great Salt Lake is one of the more valuable mineral deposits in North America, and it has been mined by evaporation for well over a century. Companies pump lake brine into shallow ponds and let the sun do the separation. As the water leaves, different salts crystallize at different concentrations in sequence, which lets an operator harvest sodium chloride, then potassium sulfate, then magnesium chloride, by controlling how far the evaporation goes in which pond. The largest of these complexes covers roughly 55,000 acres on the northeastern side near Ogden. It's one of a very small number of facilities in the world, producing sulfate of potash from naturally occurring brine. The process runs on a cycle of about 3 years from intake to harvest, and the operator has been on the lake since 1968. That company alone depleted an average of something like 111,700 acre-feet of water per year across a recent 5-year stretch, making it the largest mineral extraction water user on the lake. All the mineral operations together account for a share of the lake's total water loss that the state has put in the neighborhood of 7%, which was significant enough that the legislature moved to tighten the rules on the industry. There's a newer chapter to this that hasn't fully played out. In 2021, the same operator announced it had identified a lithium resource in its brine on the order of 2.4 million metric tons, which arrives at an obvious moment given what lithium is currently worth and what it's used for. Extracting it would require state approvals the company did not have at the time of the announcement, and reporting since has questioned how far ahead of the regulatory process those claims ran. The state legislature responded to the broader situation in 2024 by moving to tighten the terms under which mineral companies can draw water from the lake, including provisions tying extraction to lake elevation. That's a policy fight, and the outcome isn't settled. What matters for a danger ranking is the direction of pressure. A shrinking lake concentrates its own brine, which makes the brine more valuable, which increases the incentive to pump more of it out, which shrinks the lake. Feedback loops like that don't resolve themselves. Here's why a pond complex belongs on a danger ranking. The concentrated end of an evaporation sequence is brine at or beyond saturation. Falling into that is not like falling into a lake. The density interferes with swimming. The pond walls are engineered dike faces rather than beaches, and the chemical insult to eyes and airway is immediate. The ponds are deep enough in places to be over your head, and the sides don't offer purchase. The dikes themselves are the other hazard, and the more common one. They're maintenance roads. They're often the only elevated dry surface for miles, and they run for enormous distances through country where nothing else does. To someone exploring the shoreline, they look exactly like public access roads, and they are private industrial infrastructure, frequently unmarked at the point where you'd want the marking, and the ground on either side is either process water or unconsolidated sediment. And there's a third thing, which is the reason this entry outranks the military range. Evaporation ponds are dust machines when they go dry. A pond that's taken out of service, or a pond margin that's dried past the point where the crust holds, is a manufactured playa. It has been deliberately concentrated. Whatever was dissolved in the intake brine, including the trace metals the lake carries, has been mechanically concentrated by removing the water, and it's sitting on the surface in a fine crystalline layer. When the wind comes across it, that material goes up. The state's dust work has repeatedly implicated the industrial margins of the lake, alongside the natural lake bed, severity moderate to high, exposure moderate, and considerably higher than the range, because there are no armed patrols and no federal charges, just a gate that may or may not be closed, and a road that looks like it goes somewhere. The rank reflects that the hazard here is both physical and airborne, and the airborne half doesn't care where the property line is. 6. Rowley and the magnesium plant on the southwestern shore. Most places on this list draw their hazard from terrain, water, and weather in some combination. This one owes almost all of it to a factory, and it's the clearest case in the basin of a hazard that has outlived the operation that produced it. The site sits at Rowley in Toole County on the southwestern shore, about 40 miles from Salt Lake City, covering roughly 4,500 acres. A magnesium plant started operating there in 1972. The process took lake brine, concentrated it in evaporation ponds, and then electrolyzed magnesium chloride to produce magnesium metal. That reaction liberates chlorine, and for a long stretch of the plant's history, what came off the operation was a chemical inventory that reads like a catalog of the things environmental regulation was invented to control: heavy metals, acidic wastewater, polychlorinated biphenyls, dioxins and furans, hexachlorobenzene, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Stay on the chlorine for a moment, because for years, this facility was one of the largest single sources of certain airborne pollutants in the country by some measures, and the pattern of emissions from a plant like that is not a plume that stays over the plant. Chlorine gas and chlorinated organic compounds released at the shoreline drift across open water and open playa with nothing to intercept them. Federal regulators pursued the operation over its handling of hazardous waste for the better part of 2 decades, and the litigation history is long, contested, and not a subject where a summary does anyone favors. The Environmental Protection Agency put the site on the National Priorities List in 2009. Itzitzashamash, which is the formal designation for the country's most serious contaminated sites. The agency's assessment is that contaminants there have been released into air, soil, surface water, and groundwater, and that they carry both cancer and non-cancer health risks to people and to wildlife. Now, the part that keeps this a live problem. In December of 2024, the state canceled the company's mineral lease. In the summer of 2025, DOE Altlier Francis Assembrick, regulators issued a cease and desist order directing it to stop pumping water out of the Great Salt Lake. The company subsequently filed for bankruptcy. The cleanup, by public estimates, runs to something like $100 million. And there is now an open question about who pays for it. Bankruptcy is the part that ought to get more attention than it does, because of what it does to the physics. A contaminated site under an operating company has a maintenance budget. Somebody pumps the ponds, patches the liners, monitors the wells, and responds when something moves. A contaminated site under a bankrupt company has a trustee, a queue of creditors, and a schedule set by a court. The waste doesn't pause for the proceedings. Set aside the legal argument. The physical situation is this: a very large contaminated industrial site on the shore of a lake that is retreating. With waste ponds and process residues, that were designed around the assumption that the lake would stay roughly where it was, and a responsible party in bankruptcy. Some of the containment strategy at sites like this depends on water, on brine cover, on saturated ground, on the lake itself acting as a boundary condition. When the water leaves, containment that was passive becomes active, and active containment requires an operator with money. Exposure for an individual person is low. This is fenced, posted, remote industrial ground, and there's no reason for anyone to be there. It ranks 6th because the severity is high, the situation is unresolved, and because a site like this is a dust source in exactly the same way a dry pond is, sitting on the upwind side of a basin where the wind has somewhere to take it. That's the pattern that starts dominating from here down. The hazard stops being something you go to. 5. The tailings impoundment at Magna. On the southeastern shore of the Great Salt Lake, between the town of Magna and the water, there's a flat-topped landform that reads as a mesa from a distance and was assembled by machinery. It covers something on the order of 5,700 acres. It is made of finely ground rock, the leftover material from more than a century of copper processing at Bingham Canyon, delivered as slurry, settled out, and stacked. Alongside it sit a slag pile and a refinery evaporation pond. Magna is directly south of the whole complex, close enough that the impoundment is simply part of the horizon for everyone who lives there. To understand the volume involved, you have to look at where the material comes from. Bingham Canyon, up in the Oquirrh Mountains, southwest of the valley, is one of the largest open-pit mines on Earth, a hole roughly 2.5 miles across and something like 3/4 of a mile deep, worked continuously since 1906. Copper ore at that scale is a low-grade proposition. The overwhelming majority of what comes out of the pit is waste rock and tailings, and the tailings have to go somewhere. They went to the lakeshore. The pit itself has demonstrated what happens when a very large artificial slope stops cooperating. In April of 2013, a wall of the mine failed in 2 massive slides within a few hours, moving on the order of 150 million tons of rock. The company had been monitoring the movement for months and had evacuated the area, so nobody was killed. And the event is mostly remembered now for the monitoring that saw it coming. It remains among the largest non-volcanic landslides recorded in North America. That's the operation whose byproducts are stacked next to the Great Salt Lake, and the impoundment isn't finished growing. An approved expansion covers thousands of additional acres to the north and raises the structure higher in places, and the permitting for it involved the loss of several hundred acres of lakeshore wetland. 2 things make this the highest-ranked piece of industrial ground on the list, and they're independent of each other. The first is what's happening to the structure. A tailings impoundment is a dam, and this one is a very large one. Its containment strategy relies in part on a natural clay layer underneath that's supposed to keep the water inside the tailings from mixing with the shallow aquifer below. State water quality regulators alerted the federal agency to the fact that the facility has settled roughly 20 feet and that it continues to sink at a rate near 9/10 of a foot per year. Settlement at that magnitude raises a specific question about whether the clay barrier is still doing its job, or whether deterioration has opened a pathway between the tailings water and the groundwater that feeds the wetlands on the lake's edge. In a 5-year review, the Environmental Protection Agency concluded that the wetlands and groundwater near the tailings pond are not protective of human health and the environment. That's regulatory language, and the phrasing carries more weight than it looks like it does. So here's the translation. It means the conditions there do not currently meet the standard the cleanup was supposed to achieve. The company that owns the operation has stated publicly that it stands by the safety of the impoundment, and that the facility meets, and in some respects exceeds, required standards. Both of those things can be reported accurately at the same time, and both are on the record. The history here has some weight to it. Reporting in the late 2000s, documented the company apologizing over how it had handled communication with Magna residents about risk information relating to the tailings facility. Whatever one concludes about that episode, it shaped how people in that town read subsequent assurances, and it's part of why the impoundment is a live political object in that town and not background scenery. The second thing is selenium. Selenium is an element that living things need in trace amounts, and that becomes a serious problem slightly above trace amounts. The margin between essential and toxic is unusually narrow. In birds, elevated selenium concentrates in eggs, and the documented effects include weakened shells and embryonic deformity. It doesn't kill adult birds dramatically. It quietly reduces the number of chicks that survive to fly, which in a system hosting 10 million migratory birds is a mechanism that could do enormous damage without producing a single visible casualty. Over a century of mining in that district has created groundwater plumes carrying selenium toward the lake's wetlands. A federal survey covering a 2-year monitoring period found that discharge from the copper operations drain and outflow from the Bear River together contributed roughly half the total selenium load entering the South Arm, which puts a single industrial source in the same weight class as one of the 3 rivers feeding the entire lake. Then, in December of 2024, regulators reported elevated selenium in migratory bird eggs collected near a discharge point, at concentrations the state had not documented before. A small number of shorebird eggs, tested and found high enough to trigger a formal response. The division director sent letters requiring both the mining company and a water district to reduce selenium in their discharges. So that's the ground. Now the air, because this is where the entry earns its rank. On the 27th of April, 2025, a dust event moved across the western Salt Lake Valley and hit Magna, the west side of Salt Lake City, and part of Toole County. The material came from 2 adjacent source areas, exposed lakebed near Saltair and the tailing site. Both contributed, mixed together, arriving at the same time in the neighborhoods immediately downwind. Here's the detail that should bother anyone who cares about this problem. The Regulatory Monitoring Network did not capture that event. Until September of 2024, there were only 4 monitors in the region measuring coarse particulate. They were in course to step, and none of them sat within 10 miles of the shoreline. The count went to 6. There are still gaps, and the southwestern shore, which is where that storm came from, is one of them. During the 2025 legislative session, lawmakers were asked for roughly $650,000 to expand dust monitoring around the lake. They approved $150,000. That's the actual state of knowledge. A dust plume with an industrial component crossed a populated area, and the answer to how bad it was is that nobody measured it, because the instruments weren't there. Severity high, exposure high, and unlike everything ranked below it, the exposure isn't a choice. The people of Magna aren't visiting. They live there, downwind of a 5,700-acre pile of processed rock and an expanse of dry lakebed, on the side of the valley that gets the wind first. 4. Bear River Bay and the northern wetlands. Everything from here to the top is wetland, and it needs stating plainly why places full of birds and shallow water outrank a bombing range, a Superfund site, and a hypersaline sea. Because this is where the biology fails, and biological failure in a basin like this produces hazards that reach people. Bear River Bay occupies the northeastern lobe of the lake, where the Bear River finally arrives after a long looping course through 3 states. It's often described as the longest river in North America that never reaches the sea, and it's the single largest source of fresh water entering this system. Around its delta sits the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, established by Congress in 1928, when 65,000 acres were set aside. Today, the refuge protects roughly 74,000 acres of wetland, open water, and upland. Read the reason it was created, and you find the entry's central subject already there. Congress set that land aside in response to the loss of marshland and to enormous bird die-offs from botulism. The refuge exists because birds were dying in heaps a century ago, in the same place from the same disease. The refuge has also been erased once already, which matters because it establishes how violently this system swings. During the flood years of the mid-1980s, the rising lake pushed salt water up into the freshwater impoundments and destroyed them. Dikes went under. The headquarters building was demolished by the water. Decades of habitat management were wiped out in a couple of seasons. And volunteers were still picking debris out of the marsh years afterward. Rebuilding the dike system took most of the 1990s. And a new visitor center didn't open until 2004, so this is a place that has been destroyed by too much water and is now being degraded by too little, inside a single human career. That's the tempo of the basin, and it's the reason nobody who works here talks about equilibrium. Avian botulism is caused by a toxin produced by a bacterium called Clostridium botulinum, which lives as spores in wetland sediment and is essentially always present. The spores are harmless in that state. What matters is the conditions. The bacterium needs oxygen-free, protein-rich, warm conditions to germinate and produce toxin. Shallow water, warm weather, decaying organic material, and fluctuating water levels that alternately flood and expose sediment create almost exactly that environment. Once toxin is present, it moves through the system in a loop that's hard to break. A bird ingests toxin, becomes paralyzed, and dies. The carcass becomes an oxygen-free, protein-rich medium, and maggots feeding on it accumulate toxin in their tissue without being harmed. Another bird eats the maggots and receives a far larger dose than the water alone would have provided. Each dead bird effectively manufactures the next several. The disease appears in Utah almost every year, generally between July and September. In 1997, the estimated loss at the Great Salt Lake was 514,000 waterfowl, 500,000 birds in one season, in one basin. In the autumn of 2023, it happened again, on a smaller but still severe scale. Biologists started finding dead birds in mid-September. By early October, the state had identified suspected avian botulism, and the estimate was tens of thousands of birds affected, concentrated in Bear River Bay and the Willard Spur wetlands just south of it. State biologists described the year as unusually bad. Now, human risk, stated carefully, because this is the kind of subject where a half-stated fact is worse than none. People are regarded as fairly resistant to the type of botulinum toxin that drives these waterfowl outbreaks. That's the state wildlife agency's own position, and outbreaks in Utah are not typically associated with human illness. Their guidance to waterfowl hunters during an outbreak is specific and has several parts, and the parts only work together. Harvest only birds that are actively flying. Do not take birds that appear sick, weak, or unable to fly properly. Cook meat thoroughly, because thorough cooking destroys the toxin. And keep dogs away from dead and dying birds, because dogs are not resistant in the way people are. And a retriever working a marsh full of carcasses is exposed in a way its handler isn't. That's the whole rule set. And it should be treated as one instruction rather than 4, because following 3 of them and skipping the 4th is how a hunting dog ends up in an emergency clinic. Breaking that cycle is brutal, unglamorous field work, and it's how these outbreaks actually get contained. Crews go out into the marsh in boats and on foot and pick up carcasses, day after day for weeks, because every carcass removed is a batch of toxin-loaded maggots that never gets produced. It's the closest thing to a control measure that exists. There's no vaccine for a wild bird population and no way to treat a wetland. You remove the dead. You manage water levels to avoid the shallow, warm stagnation that starts it, and you wait for the season to turn. Why does Bear River Bay land at 4? 2 reasons. The shrinking lake has made this bay one of the most volatile places in the basin. Bear River Bay is very shallow, so a small change in lake elevation exposes a very large area of it, and that alternating flood and drain cycle is a botulism accelerator. It also converts the bay floor into playa, on a scale that matters for dust. When Bear River Bay goes dry, the area that opens up runs to tens of thousands of acres, and this is the place where the largest single concentration of the lake's 10 to 12 million migratory birds actually lands. Whatever happens here happens to a substantial fraction of several continental populations at once. 3. Farmington Bay. If you've driven the freeway north out of Salt Lake City toward Ogden, you've driven along the edge of Farmington Bay, probably without registering it as a bay at all. On the east side of that stretch, there are subdivisions, high schools, and shopping centers. On the west side, past a fringe of phragmites, there's a shallow sheet of water about 110 square miles in area, averaging something in the neighborhood of 1.5 feet deep. Half of what's in it is treated municipal wastewater. That number comes from limnologists who've been studying the bay for a couple of decades, and it isn't a scandal or an accusation. It's the arithmetic of a metropolitan area with 3 wastewater treatment plants discharging into a drainage that ends at Farmington Bay. The plants meet their permits. The water has been treated. But treatment removes pathogens and organic load far more effectively than it removes nitrogen and phosphorus are fertilizer. So what you have is a very shallow, very warm, very slow-moving body of water receiving fertilizer continuously. The result is one of the most nutrient-loaded water bodies anybody has measured in the state. On the standard index limnologists use to rate how enriched a lake is, Farmington Bay has scored around 91, higher than any other lake or reservoir Utah has evaluated. The scale doesn't really have a comfortable place to put a number like that. What grows in those conditions, when the salinity happens to sit in the right window of roughly 2 to 5%, is a cyanobacterium called Nodularia spumigena. It produces a toxin that damages liver tissue in mammals. Measurements in Farmington Bay have found concentrations above 50 micrograms per liter, which is far beyond the World Health Organization's thresholds for recreational contact. That's a real hazard with a real exposure pathway, and precision about who's exposed matters a great deal here, because the honest version is more limited than the alarming version. Nobody swims in Farmington Bay. It's a foot deep, it's opaque, and it smells. The realistic exposure routes are people wading while hunting or working, dogs that go in and then lick themselves dry, and aerosolized material when wind whips across a bloom. Dogs are the serious one. A dog that swims through a cyanobacteria bloom and grooms afterward can receive a dose that a person standing beside it never approaches. Then there's the smell, which is the thing everybody in northern Utah has an opinion about. Periodically, the whole Wasatch Front gets hit with a rotten egg odor, and the reflexive local explanation is that the Great Salt Lake stinks. Researchers who chased this down found the source narrower than that. Nutrient-rich water feeds enormous algal growth. The algae die. Bacteria decompose them in oxygen-free conditions on the bay bottom, and that decomposition releases hydrogen sulfide. Wind moving across a very shallow bay stirs it up and pushes it inland. The Antelope Island Causeway crosses the bay's western end and limits how freely that water can flush out into the larger lake, which means the enriched water sits and works. That smell is the sensory signature of a chemical process, and hydrogen sulfide at high concentration is genuinely dangerous. At the concentrations reaching neighborhoods, it's an unpleasant nuisance well short of a health emergency. As a signal, though, it's informative. The nose is detecting a decomposition process running at a scale most people never encounter. There's also a plant problem here that quietly makes everything else worse. The margins of Farmington Bay, along with much of the lake's eastern shoreline, have been overrun by phragmites, a tall invasive reed that forms dense stands 10 or 12 feet high. It does 3 unhelpful things at once. It drinks heavily, which removes water from a system that has none to spare. It shades out the shallow, open water and mudflat that shorebirds actually feed on, converting productive habitat into a wall. And it forms a physical barrier that makes it substantially harder to reach the bay on foot, which matters for anyone who needs to get to a person or a dog in trouble out there. Crews have been fighting it with mowing, grazing, and herbicide for years, with real success in treated areas and no prospect of finishing. Botulism lives here too, on the same terms as Bear River Bay. Dead birds have turned up at Farmington Bay during the same outbreaks that hit the northern wetlands. There's one more layer to Farmington Bay that connects it back to the deep water chemistry described earlier. Shallow, warm, oxygen-poor, sulfur-rich sediment is exactly the environment where inorganic mercury gets converted into the methylated form that climbs a food chain. And Farmington Bay has that environment across most of its area for much of the year. Elevated mercury in Great Salt Lake waterfowl is the reason Utah issued consumption advisories for certain duck species. Those advisories are specific. They name particular species, and they've been revised as monitoring has continued. So anyone hunting these wetlands should be reading the current version from the state, rather than relying on what somebody remembers from a decade ago, which is the practical point about this bay generally. It's a heavily used waterfowl management area. People hunt it, work it, walk dogs in it, and study it. The exposure isn't hypothetical, and underneath all of it there's the same trajectory. Farmington Bay is shallow enough that modest changes in lake level drain very large portions of it. When it drains, the exposed bottom is nutrient-saturated organic sediment on the immediate upwind side of Bountiful, Centerville, Farmington, and Kaysville. That material has a different composition from the mineral playa on the west side of the lake, and it's sitting a couple of miles from 100,000 front doors. One thing to keep straight because it gets muddled constantly in conversations about this bay. The wastewater plants are doing what they were built to do, and the people running them are not villains in this story. Nutrient removal at the scale required here is expensive infrastructure that has to be paid for by ratepayers. The standards governing it have been evolving, and Utah has been working through a process to set nutrient limits for discharges to these wetlands. The bay's condition is a consequence of a metropolitan area of 2.5 million people existing upstream of a shallow terminal water body. Under permits written when the science and the population were both different. Assigning blame to an operator is easier than fixing a nutrient budget and considerably less useful. So Farmington Bay outranks Bear River Bay for one reason, and it's the reason that governs the entire top of this list. Bear River Bay has more birds, a longer botulism history, and a bigger exposed footprint. Farmington Bay has people. The nearest houses to the northern wetlands are in small agricultural towns. The nearest houses to Farmington Bay are in one of the fastest-growing suburban corridors in the American West, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, too. Antelope Island. Here's where the criterion stops being a thought experiment and starts being a turnstile count. Antelope Island is the largest island in the Great Salt Lake, a little over 40 square miles of grassland and rock running north to south off the eastern shore. And it is the only place in this entire basin where the general public shows up in serious numbers. It's a state park. There's an entrance station, a visitor center, a marina, a beach, campgrounds, trails, a historic ranch, and a paved road down the spine of the island. Roughly 4 million people have visited across the past decade. Every hazard discussed so far in this list is present on or around that island, and it's the only place where all of them coincide with a crowd. Start with the Road Inn. The causeway runs about 7 miles west from the mainland, straight across the northern end of Farmington Bay. It's the reason the island is accessible at all, and its history is a lesson in how fast this basin moves. During the flood years of the 1980s, when the lake rose 14 feet in 3 years, the causeway ended up under 8 feet of water and the park closed entirely. It took political pressure through 1990 and 91, a redesign and a rebuild, before the new causeway was dedicated on the 31st of October, 1993. The island spent the better part of a decade unreachable. Now the water is at the other extreme, and the causeway crosses a bay that is largely mudflat for much of the year, which puts every driver on that road within a few dozen yards of the exact material described earlier. People lived out here, which is the detail that reframes the island for most visitors. There's a ranch at the southeastern end, established in the 1840s, and it operated as a working livestock outfit for well over a century. The buildings are still standing and open to the public, which makes it one of the oldest continuously standing structures in the state built by settlers. The people who ran it dealt with the same three problems every day that a visitor now encounters for an afternoon. No reliable fresh water beyond a few springs, no easy way off the island, and weather with nothing to break it. That history is a useful corrective to the way the island gets marketed. Living out there was entirely possible, and it always depended on knowing precisely where the water was. A day visitor has no idea. Then the insects, which sound like a joke until you're standing in them. From roughly April through June, the island produces biting gnats, called no-see-ums locally, in densities that people find hard to believe. They're small enough to pass through ordinary mesh. They bite. The bites itch for days. And on a still spring morning near the shoreline, the air can be thick enough with them that visitors abandon a hike within minutes of leaving the car. By midsummer, the gnats fade and the brine flies take over, particularly along the causeway and the shore. Brine flies don't bite. They just exist in numbers with no useful comparison, forming dark, shifting mats along the waterline. And they're a keystone food source for millions of birds, which is why nobody controls them. Neither insect is dangerous in the medical sense to most people. What they do is drive behavior. Visitors who came to walk the shoreline retreat to their cars, change plans, and end up doing something they hadn't prepared for. Then there's the bison. Antelope Island carries a free-ranging bison herd that dates to 1893, when a dozen animals were brought over by boat. The herd is now managed at several hundred, and the animals are genuinely wild. They're not fenced away from the trails. The trails go through their range. A bison is a 2,000-pound animal that can run in the neighborhood of 35 miles an hour and turn faster than a person can react. In the past decade, against something like 4 million visits, wildlife officials have documented roughly 5 incidents involving visitors and bison. That ratio matters, and any honest ranking has to say it out loud. The odds that any individual visitor gets hurt by a bison on Antelope Island are very small. But the severity when it happens is severe, and one of those incidents was fatal. In August of 2020, a man from Syracuse was found badly injured on a trail and later died. Officials concluded he had most likely been gored. In another documented case, Unwansa Marisa Wananikeisum, a woman in her early 20s running on a lakeside trail, was struck by a bison, lifted off the ground, and had to be flown to a hospital in Ogden with lower body injuries. The pattern in nearly every one of these incidents is the same, and wildlife officials have been unusually direct about it. The person got too close. Very often, the person got too close in order to take a photograph. The guidance from the State Wildlife Agency is specific, and like the botulism guidance, it only works as a complete set. Give bison a very wide berth and never approach one for any reason, including a picture. Watch the animal's behavior, because a bison signals agitation before it acts. It raises its tail, it turns to face you, it stops feeding and fixes on you. It may paw or bob its head. If a bison is close to you or standing on the trail, either back away slowly and return the way you came, or leave the trail entirely and pass at a substantial distance. Never try to move past it on the trail. Never try to move it along. And never get between an animal and its calf. If you're on a bike or running, slow down and make your presence obvious from a distance, rather than appearing suddenly at close range. That last part is easy to skip. and it accounts for a meaningful share of the close calls, because a runner coming quietly around a rise looks a great deal like something arriving fast. Antelope Island is also, quietly, where a lot of the lake's emergencies come ashore. When those three kayakers got into trouble in the wind, the island's shoreline is where the first one made land and called for help, and where searchers found the second one after midnight on the west side. It functions as the lake's only substantial piece of walkable high ground for miles in any direction, which means it collects people who didn't intend to arrive there. Layer on the ordinary things. The island has almost no shade. Summer temperatures on the exposed western side run high, and there's no water source on the trails. The shoreline has receded so far in places that the walk from a parking area to actual water crosses a long stretch of soft lake bed, and people make that walk in flip-flops on a hot afternoon carrying nothing. And this island sits in the middle of the dust story too. It has an established road system, an established trail system, and hundreds of thousands of feet, wheels, and hooves working the surface every year, which is precisely the mechanism that breaks the protective crust on exposed sediment. So why does Antelope Island land at 2? Because the exposure term is not close. Farmington Bay has more people living beside it, and almost none of them physically enter it. Antelope Island has hundreds of thousands of people per year walking directly onto the hazard, in ordinary clothing, with ordinary expectations, in a place that presents itself with an entrance station and a gift shop, which is the international symbol for a managed environment where nothing very bad is going to happen. It's a state park with a bison herd, hypersaline water, biting insects, deep mud, no shade, and a causeway across an anoxic bay. That combination doesn't exist anywhere else in this basin, and the people encountering it are, by design, the least prepared population on the list. 1. The dry bed of the southern shore, between Saltaire and the airport. There's a stretch of ground on the south side of the lake, running roughly from the old resort site eastward toward the interstate interchange and the airport, that most people have looked at 10,000 times without seeing. It's flat, pale, and featureless. It's crossed by a freeway, a railroad, and a set of power lines. It has a parking lot on it. 50 years ago, most of it was underwater. That ground is the most dangerous place around the Great Salt Lake. And demonstrating that requires walking through the arithmetic rather than asserting it, because on any single afternoon it's also the most boring place on this entire list. Start with the history, because the history is the mechanism in slow motion. In 1893, a consortium, including the railroads and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, opened a pavilion on the South Shore called Saltaire and marketed it as the Coney Island of the West. It stood on more than 2,000 pilings driven into the lake bed, with a dance floor, a bathing beach, and a rail line running out from the city. 10,000 people came the first day. For about 3 decades, it was the social center of the region. Then, it started losing fights. Fire took the original building in 1925. Another fire caused more damage in 1931. And in 1933, the lake did something the owners had no answer for. It went down, and it left the resort standing in dry sand, a considerable distance from any water. Their solution was to build a miniature railway to carry bathers from the pavilion out to wherever the shoreline had gone that season. A resort with a shuttle to reach its own beach. The second Saltaire burned in 1970. A third building went up about a mile west in 1981 and promptly flooded because the lake had swung the other way. And then the water retreated again and left it stranded in turn. It survives now as a concert venue, which is a considerably more sustainable relationship with a lake that refuses to hold still. That's 130 years of people trying to keep a fixed structure next to a moving shoreline and losing every time. And the reason it matters here is that the shoreline didn't stop moving when the resorts gave up. It kept going, and everything it uncovered on the way is still lying there. Hold the salt air era in your head for a second, because the contrast measures the change better than any elevation figure does. There was a period when tens of thousands of people from this valley spent summer weekends in the water of the Great Salt Lake. Bathing costumes, a dance band, a train from downtown, and a beach with actual waves on it. Swimming in the lake was an ordinary thing that ordinary families did. Almost nobody swims in it now. The water is farther away, the walkout crosses mudflat, the salinity is higher than it was, and a couple of generations have grown up understanding the lake as something you look at from a freeway. That shift in behavior happened gradually enough that nobody experienced it as a loss, and the practical result is a large population living beside a body of water that they have no physical relationship with at all. It's very hard to get people to spend money protecting something they've never stood in. Now the geography is what makes this the top entry. The Salt Lake Valley opens toward the lake at its northwestern corner. The metropolitan area's main airport sits near that opening, on low ground close to the water. Close enough that during the flood years of the 1980s, it was one of the assets the state built emergency pumps to protect. The interstate runs along the south shore. The valley's west side neighborhoods, Magna, and the western edge of Salt Lake City sit directly inland of it. And the dominant weather pattern that produces the strongest winds in this basin comes through in spring, when cold fronts sweep down across the exposed bed and push eastward into the valley. So the dry lake bed on the southern shore has three things that no other exposed ground in this basin has simultaneously. It's disturbed, it's contaminated, and it's upwind of everybody. Disturbed matters enormously. The natural salt crust that holds this sediment in place is remarkably effective as long as it stays intact, which is why only a small share of the total exposed bed actually emits dust. But this particular stretch has a freeway on it, a railroad on it, industrial operations at both ends, off-road vehicle traffic across it, and construction along its margins. It's the most physically worked piece of exposed lake bed in the system. Contaminated matters because of where it sits. This is the corner of the basin that received a century and a half of smelting and refining. Arsenic is present in the sediment across the lake for reasons that predate industry, but the southern shore adds copper processing residue, historic smelter fallout, and the runoff of the metropolitan area on top of it. When researchers characterized the dust coming off this playa and compared it against the other dust sources that regularly blow into this valley, the lake material came back more chemically reactive, with more metal content available to leach out of the particle and into whatever tissue it lands in. And upwind of everybody is the denominator that decides this ranking. Roughly 2.5 million people live in the 4 counties along the Wasatch Front, and the population is growing faster than almost anywhere in the country. Something in the neighborhood of 1 in 10 Utahns has asthma. Children, older adults, people with existing respiratory or cardiac conditions, and anyone who works outdoors sit at the front of the risk distribution. And unlike every other entry on this list, none of them chose to be there. Consider the 27th of April, 2025, one more time from the receiving end. Material lifted off the lake bed near Saltair and off the adjacent industrial ground and moved east into Magna, into western Salt Lake City, and into part of Toole County. It was visible. People photographed it. It reduced visibility, it coated cars, and it went into lungs. And the formal air quality record of that event is essentially blank, because the monitoring network in the region measuring coarse particulate had no instrument positioned where the plume came from. There's a second and much more immediate hazard in these events that gets overshadowed by the chemistry, and it needs saying plainly because it produces casualties on a time scale of seconds instead of decades. Blowing dust destroys visibility on a highway. The interstate crosses the south shore of this lake in a long, straight run, with almost nothing to break the wind, and a dense plume moving across that alignment can take visibility from miles to a few car lengths without warning. Multi-vehicle collisions and blowing dust are a recurring and well-documented pattern across the arid West, and the reason they're so lethal is that the road ahead looks clear right up until the moment it doesn't. And everybody's instinct is to brake hard in a place where the driver behind can't see them do it. Peak season for these events runs roughly from March through May when the fronts come through. Individual events are short, a few hours, sometimes less. But the spike inside that window is what the standard was written to catch, and the federal threshold for coarse particulate is 150 micrograms per cubic meter averaged over a day. Between 2023 and 2025, 3 monitoring stations near the lake recorded exceedances of that standard, one at Hawthorne, one at the site by the prison, and 2 at the station called Tech. Now, honesty, because this is where a ranking like this either earns its top position or reveals itself as theater. The region is currently in attainment for coarse particulate. That's the formal regulatory finding, and it means the measured air, on the whole, meets the federal standard. There is no body count attached to Great Salt Lake dust. Nobody has produced a death certificate that names it. The strongest toxicology is from animal and cell models, which establish that this material is unusually potent per unit mass and do not tell you how many human hospital admissions it causes in a given year. The epidemiological work connecting the exposed lakebed to specific health outcomes along the Wasatch Front is genuinely in progress, and anybody who tells you the number is settled is telling you something that isn't yet known. So how does a hazard with no confirmed casualties outrank an island where a man was killed by a bison? By doing the multiplication, the criterion demanded from the start. On Antelope Island, roughly 5 documented injury incidents against something like 4 million visits over a decade. That's a severe hazard with an extremely small probability of encounter, and it's the correct model for almost everything ranked below. On the southern shore, the encounter probability is 1. Everyone who lives in the valley is exposed every year without any decision on their part. The severity per exposure is small and chronic, the opposite profile from everything below it. But a small effect multiplied by 2.5 million people repeated every spring, across a population that includes several 100,000 people with compromised airways, produces an expected harm that no single incident hazard on this list comes close to matching. That's the whole argument, and it's the reason the criterion had to be built the way it was built at the beginning. If danger only meant severity, this entry wouldn't be in the top 10. If danger only meant frequency, it would have been number 1 before any of the evidence came in. Danger as expected harm across the exposed population puts it first, and it does so by a margin that isn't close. It's also the only entry on this list where the hazard is growing on a schedule you can read off a gauge. Everything else here is roughly static or slowly variable. The bombing range's ordnance load isn't increasing. The bison herd isn't getting larger. The salt flats aren't spreading, but every foot the lake drops adds new exposed sediment on the southern shore, and every year of traffic and weather breaks a little more crust on the sediment that's already there. The hazard has a growth rate, and the growth rate is a function of a water budget, and the timing is unfortunate in a way that compounds it. The population of this valley is expanding fast, and the direction of expansion on the west side is toward the lake, because that's where the developable land is. New neighborhoods are being built closer to the source at the same time the source is getting larger. Those two curves are moving toward each other. There's a final piece, and it's the one that separates this ground from everything else structurally. Every other place on this list requires you to travel to it. The bombing range needs a boat and a bad decision. The salt flats need a tank of gas. The tailings impoundment needs a trespass. Even Farmington Bay needs you to walk down to the water. This one arrives at your house. The research on who receives it has been unambiguous about one thing in particular. Work out of the University of Utah has found that the burden of lake dust falls disproportionately on the valley's lower income and more racially diverse neighborhoods, which sit on the west side, closest to the exposed bed and to the industrial corridor. Modeling of the same question found that keeping water in the lake reduces both total dust exposure and the disparity in who breathes it. The people with the least capacity to relocate are standing closest to the source, which is a pattern with a long and boring history in American environmental policy, and is no less true here for being predictable. That's the number one position. Flat, pale, crossed by a freeway, containing a concert venue and a parking lot, ranked first on a list of dangerous places because of a hazard that is invisible on the day you're standing there and arrives in your kitchen the following spring. A ranking like this has a shelf life, and the thing that sets it is easy to name. Every position on this list is a function of one variable, not the only variable, but the dominant one. Lake elevation sets how much bed is exposed, which sets how much dust is available. It sets whether an island is an island. It sets the salinity in both arms, which sets whether brine shrimp hatch, which sets whether 10 million birds find food. It sets whether a marina has water in it, and whether a wetland floods and drains on the schedule that manufactures botulism. Change the elevation and the whole order shuffles. So here's the state of that variable as measured. The scientific team that reports to the Utah legislature published its most recent summary at the start of this year, and the headline finding was mixed in a way that resists a clean story. The lake's south arm remains about 6.5 to 7 feet below the elevation the state considers a minimum for a healthy system. The 2025 water year closed at the third lowest reading in a record spanning more than 120 years. As of this summer, the gauge at Saltair sits near 4,190 feet. By the state's own classification, the lake is back in the range where serious adverse effects are expected. That's the bad column. The other column is real too. Salinity in the south arm has stayed close to healthy targets because the berm at the causeway is now actively managed as a salinity control rather than left to whatever the rock happens to do. Brine shrimp egg counts came up by roughly half from the previous year. The north arm gained close to 3 feet in a recent season. 9 new dust monitoring stations have gone in around the lake, and 13 existing ones have been upgraded, which begins to close the gap that made that April dust event invisible to the official record. Crews have knocked back invasive phragmites across large stretches of shoreline, with treated areas showing something like an 88% reduction in cover, which matters because phragmites drinks heavily and chokes out the shallow open water that shorebirds need. $50 million in federal money has been released. Private commitments running to a couple $100 million more have been made. Water rights holders have donated a cumulative 163,000 acre-feet and change back to the lake, which is a genuinely new thing in Western water and would have been considered eccentric 20 years ago. Against all of that sits one number that puts the effort in proportion. To have even a coin flip's chance of getting this lake back to a healthy elevation by the time Salt Lake City hosts the Winter Games in 2034, the modeling says the basin needs an additional 800,000 acre-feet arriving every year, sustained, on top of everything already committed. That's an annual requirement, repeated indefinitely, and it's larger than any single conservation measure yet enacted. And the largest growth in consumption over the last 2 decades has been residential, and most of that is outdoor. Lawns and landscaping in a desert, in a basin where the alternative use of that water is keeping several hundred square miles of contaminated sediment underwater and out of the air. Which reframes what the top of this list actually is. The ground that took the number 1 position is being manufactured, foot by a water budget. And the same budget can unmake it. That's an unusual thing to be able to say about a hazard. Nobody moves a mountain out of an avalanche path. This one has a dial on it. The dial is measured in acre-feet, and the readings are published every year. It's fair to ask which way the individual positions would move if the water came back, because that's the clearest test of whether the ruler was built honestly. Raise the lake 5 feet, and the sandbar to the third largest island goes under, and that entry drops. Raise it 8, and the bombing range needs a boat again, and it falls off the bottom of the list. Raise it enough, and the land bridge to the Pelican colony closes. The marina works. The mud flats narrow. The salinity in both arms moves back toward the range where shrimp hatch and flies breed, and several hundred square miles of loaded sediment goes back underwater where it can't be lifted by anything. Every one of those is a position on this list reversing. That's the property that separates a ranking of a moving system from a ranking of mountains. And it's the reason a list like this has to state its criterion out loud, because the criterion is the only part that stays put. That's the honest verdict, and it should be uncomfortable in both directions. The most dangerous place around the Great Salt Lake is a stretch of flat, pale ground with a freeway across it on the south shore, upwind of a couple of million people. It got that way inside a single human lifetime. It stays that way only as long as the lake stays low, and the lake's elevation this summer, near 4,190 feet at the Saltaire gauge, is a number somebody is writing down every 15 minutes whether anyone reads it or not. The rock spiral out on the north arm makes the point better than any projection does. It sat underwater and invisible for about 30 years, and it has been sitting in dry white salt for about 25. The artist expected the lake to keep it. The lake gave it back. Nothing in this basin is permanent in either direction, which is the entire reason the ranking has an expiration date printed on it. Now the part where I hand you something to do with all of this. You almost certainly disagreed with at least one of these 17 positions, and I'd like to hear which one, with the reasoning attached. Which place would you move? And more importantly, what ruler would you have used instead? Weight severity harder, and the ordnance ground goes back on top. Throw out exposure entirely, and the ranking becomes a lethality contest that describes almost nobody. Count harm to the 10 million birds as harm, which this list mostly declined to do, and the wetlands take the top 4 positions outright. Every one of those is a defensible choice, and everyone produces a completely different list. Drop yours in the comments, criterion first, place second, because the ruler is the argument, and the ranking is just the receipt. And if this made a landscape you've driven past 100 times finally legible, the like button is the cheapest way to tell an algorithm that careful things are worth showing to people. Subscribe if you want more of them. Then go look up what elevation the lake is sitting at today. It takes about 11 seconds, the number is public, and once you know where to find it, you'll never look at that stretch of freeway the same way again.